part 4 of this video series. Today we're going to take a more detailed look into small boat galleys. I'm sure most people know that a kitchen on a boat is called a galley, but just in case I wanted to point it out. Galleys are probably the biggest expression of compromise on a small boat. Everyone wants a big kitchen like they have in their house, but that's obviously impossible. I have seen boat manufacturers try to convince us that a stove under a berth, a sink too small to wash your hands in, and zero counter space is good enough, but I don't know anybody who would be satisfied with this for even a weekend. Personally, I try to avoid the everything needs to do 2 or more functions on a small boat because most people are inherently lazy. A bed that folds up into a dinette will usually either stay made up as a dinette or left as a bed at least 95% of the time. The galley is the exception. The more multifunction each piece is, the better. A quick example of this is a cutting board cover for both sink and stove to make more counter space. Okay, since I've already mentioned counter space, let's start there. I don't think anyone out there on a small boat thinks they have too much counter space. In fact, I'm guessing most people have tried to figure out how to add some more usable counter space to their boat. You can use a dinette table for more space if you have to, but quite often it's not a very efficient setup. Also, tables rarely have fiddles or ledges around it to keep food or dishes from sliding off if you get hit by a wave or a wake. Now, having said that, a lot of production boats don't even put fiddles or rails on any of the working surfaces. Some even have fiberglass galleys that are rounded down on the edges. This is usually found more on power boats than sailboats, but either way, it does happen. The most popular way to add space is to use fold-up counters. These are extremely popular addition. As for the general galley layout, there are a few common layouts in boats of this size range. However, the style of boat and headroom plays into what works and what doesn't. For example, if your boat does not have standing headroom, you would want a lower galley that you can reach while sitting. Although again, that changes if you have a pop top. Then you might want to attempt to find an arrangement you can use while standing or sitting. However, having said that, my own current little 18-foot Liveaboard has a pop top, and I rarely ever lower it. It has screens and clear vinyl windows. My galley is the split type, with a stove and microwave on one side and sink on the other. It's strictly a stand-up galley. Another option for a galley is the cross-cabin layout. This runs across the back of the cabin, and there's quite often a step in the middle to enter the cabin. These are a lot more popular on sailboats than they are on powerboats. The issue with these is it's nearly impossible to have a rear quarter berth or a rear berth under them. However, these are typically the largest amount of counter space you can get in a single-piece galley. Another popular style is a small galley off to one side. These are either placed right against the rear bulkhead or moved forward. If it is placed against the rear bulkhead, then there's no place for a quarter berth. I do prefer when it's a bit more forward, then you can put an accordion-style retractable counter over the quarter berth, giving you a lot more counter space. One mistake I have seen manufacturers make is to place the galley forward on the boat with a pop top. This makes no sense to me. Why have the galley in the one place on the boat that you can't stand up? The next type I'm going to discuss is the split type. This has half on each side of the boat facing each other. I do like these. They're usually very functional as long as they include some counter space and there's nothing in between the two counters. I have seen some bad layouts. On one sailboat, I saw there was absolutely no counter space and a mast support pole between them. This would be so awkward to use. Another type of galley is the sliding galley. These are usually on tracks or casters. They typically don't have that much space on them, but they give you much more cabin space for living. This is actually what I use on my own small boat. It's a split galley, 1/2 permanent and 1/2 sliding. Oh, and by the way, I'll include a link to my own small Liveaboard boat at the end of this video. The last type I want to discuss is the modern quarter galley. These had become very popular on small boats for a while, especially power boats. They attempt to make boat galley look like what should be in a house. This is done by shrinking everything down. A small sink, small stove, small icebox, etc. These look really good in a showroom, but they're not that functional. A lot of people have different opinions of sinks. Some people like small sinks that take very little counter space, some people like double sinks, and some people have huge sinks the size of laundry tubs. Cruising sailboats usually have very deep sinks to compensate for heeling when underway. Small boats who don't have enough counter space or space under the counter can use temporary sinks like the type used for camping. Although if it's a matter of counter space, then a simple cutting board cover can take care of that. I have lived in boats that I think have had just about every form of sink. All of them worked, as long as you make sure it's large enough to wash your largest pots and pans in. If you do plan on cooking while underway, make sure your sink is large enough to hold back any splashes. Although, I find that with the exception of ocean crossings, most people stop when it's time to wash their dishes. Microwaves are another thing that a lot of people say are a waste of space and weight. However, if your goal is to be more off-grid and you have a way to produce electricity, then these are a must. Even though they use a large amount of electricity, they normally only run for short periods of time. I will be doing a video on small boat electrical, where I'll be talking about inverters and creating electricity. I'm not really going to discuss ovens because you rarely find them on small boats. The only ones I will mention is the stovetop folding camp type. These do work as long as you find a way to add insulation to them. I've used one in the past that just had a couple extra layers of tinfoil over it, and it did make a huge difference. However, I did meet a sailor once who made a complete cover for one out of a welding blanket, and he said it worked just amazing. That sounds like the way to go to me. Okay, now for stoves. There are so many different types of stoves that run on just as many fuels, and I think I've used most of them. Today, a lot of manufacturers started using propane on boats, and people are used to it from their barbecues and in their RVs. However, propane is heavier than air, which is okay in an RV or on a barbecue because the wind will just blow it away. But in a sealed hull, the propane can build up and then eventually explode. You can buy propane detectors, etc. In fact, it's the law to have them. But I was in a marina a few years back that a boat did explode from propane. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but the fire department was saying that they had all the safety equipment. Since then, I avoid propane. Plus, you usually have to drive somewhere else to refill the normally heavy tanks. I should mention there are lighter tanks on the market if you do decide to go propane. They come in both fiberglass and aluminum. Besides weight, another advantage of this is they don't rust. Probably the next popular are non-pressurized alcohol stoves, Origo being the most popular. These comes in all forms: single burner, double burner, flush mount, gimbal mount, and stoves with ovens. Alcohol is touted as the safe fuel. I do think it's a lot safer than propane. These are very simple stoves. They work much like a large fondue burner. My only issue is the fact they don't burn very hot. They take forever to boil water, and the flame is hard to see. And if you spill some and it goes down the back of your galley, for example, you're going to have a fire that's very hard to fight. Also, some people say you can use methyl hydrate as a fuel to save money, but I've been told after prolonged use of it, it can really gum up the burner. Now, there's also pressurized alcohol stoves. You don't see these very much anymore. These used a small pump to pressurize the alcohol, and you had to preheat the burner. A lot of people hated these. I guess it does take a bit of skill to use them, but I had one in the mid-90s and I had no problem with it. Kerosene and diesel stoves are very similar to pressurized alcohol stoves, except for you couldn't preheat the burner with the kerosene, so you had to keep a little bit of alcohol around just for preheating. Electricity is also common on powerboats. Traditional electric stoves use a huge amount of power, so you rarely see them on sailboats. Even powerboats quite often use an onboard generator or plug into shore power on a nightly basis to use them. Today we have induction stoves, which is much better than the old electric stoves, but they still use quite a bit of power. And I have to mention the combination alcohol electric stoves, which use electricity when plugged into shore power and alcohol when in anchor. You usually only see these on larger powerboats, but there's no reason why you couldn't use them on any type of boat. Now, there's what I did on my little boat. A lot of people will disagree with this, but I took a small camp stove that burns twigs, etc., and I built it in. And instead of twigs, I use wood pellets. I just keep a little squeeze bottle of methyl hydrate to light it. Now, the reason I did this was I like to be as off-grid as I can. I use a 40-pound bag of pellets for $5, and it will do me for a few years. I just put them in a medium-sized freezer bag for storage. Galley storage is another issue on a small boat. There is usually not much, and what comes with the boat is usually not very well designed. Most manufacturers say by making large bins instead of drawers, etc., you can store more, and technically they're right. However, trying to find anything in a big bin can be just awful, especially small items like kitchen tools. Finding a way to organize these is an absolute must. If you can install drawers, that's the best. Using small stackable totes, that's probably second best. Oh, and hey, if you have any great storage ideas to share for galleys or for small boats in general, please share them in the comments below. Keeping food cold is our last subject. The most traditional way to do this is ice, which can be a pain. But for a lot of people, it's their only choice. Built-in ice boxes have the best insulation, therefore your ice lasts longer. Just try to make sure it has some form of a drain. Some ice boxes just have a rack at the bottom and some have both. The idea behind the rack is your food stays above the melted water, but you still have to empty it by hand, usually with a sponge, and it has to be done often. Remember, it's always better to buy ice blocks than cubes because they take a lot longer to melt. If you can find a waterproof container to put your ice in before putting it in the ice box, this is ideal, It stops you from having to clean your ice boxes often. For those who don't have a built-in ice box, you can just use a portable cooler. They don't hold ice as well, and trying to find a spot for them can be challenging. If you do use a cooler, try to keep it somewhere out of the sun, inside the cabin if it's possible. Next, we have electric chillers and refrigerators. Chillers are the type of electric coolers you can buy at your local hardware store. They use evaporation to cool the inside. These can only bring the temperature down a certain amount. I used to have one that brought it down by 15 degrees Celsius from the outside temperature. So if it was 30 degrees Celsius outside, or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the chiller it was still 15 degrees Celsius, or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not cold enough for a lot of things. Plus, the more humid the air is, the less efficient they are, and while you're on a boat on the water, humidity is part of life. Last is full refrigeration. These have a compressor inside. You can get them either built-in or portable, with or without a freezer. Both chillers and refrigerators use a large amount of electricity, but actually refrigerators use less than chillers, but they do cost quite a bit more to buy. There are some portable refrigerators that can be used as a fridge or a freezer, but not both, because they only have one compartment. There are so many options when it comes to galleys, it's hard to choose. There is no such thing as the perfect galley. All you can do is find the one that's closest to the right one for you. And please remember to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos of this series, and I'll include a link below in the description to the entire playlist. Thank you for watching, and please, again, don't forget to subscribe.